The small diner hummed with the usual sounds of morning rush hour, coffee cups clinking, the sizzling of bacon on the griddle, and the low murmur of conversations blending into the background. It was a cozy place, a family-owned restaurant, where locals gathered to start their day or catch up on neighborhood gossip. The kind of place where faces were familiar and people knew each other's names. But on this particular morning, something unusual was about to unfold, and it would leave everyone in the diner questioning what they thought they knew about the world and themselves. The doorbell jingled softly as an elderly man stepped into the diner. He moved with deliberate care, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. His dark skin was weathered, a testament to a life of hard work and resilience. He wore a neatly pressed shirt and slacks, his shoes polished to a shine that spoke volumes about his attention to detail. He looked around the room, offering a polite nod to anyone who met his gaze. Behind the counter, a waitress in her late 20s glanced up. Her name tag read Megan *, and she had been working at the diner for a few years. Megan was known for her quick wit and no-nonsense attitude, but today her expression hardened the moment her eyes landed on the elderly man. Instead of the warm greeting she offered most customers, her lips tightened and she turned her back, busying herself with a pot of coffee. The man chose a small table near the window, settling into the chair with a quiet sigh. He unfolded the menu, his hands steady despite his age. A few minutes passed, and Megan made no move to approach him. She bustled around the room, serving other customers, refilling coffee cups, and taking orders, but she avoided his table entirely. At first, the man seemed patient, perhaps assuming she was just busy. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room became palpable. Other customers began to notice. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others whispered among themselves. Finally, a young woman seated near the back of the diner stood up. She was in her early 30s, dressed in business casual attire, and her confident stride suggested she was no stranger to handling difficult situations. She walked straight up to the counter where Megan was pretending to be engrossed in the register. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "That gentleman over there has been waiting for service. Is there a reason you're ignoring him?" Megan's face flushed, but her response was defensive. "I'm busy. I'll get to him when I can." The young woman didn't back down. "It doesn't look like you're too busy to serve everyone else in here. What's really going on?" Megan hesitated, her eyes darting to the man by the window. Then she shrugged. "Look, if you're so concerned, why don't you serve him?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on the young woman now, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she walked over to the elderly man's table, her expression softening as she approached. "Hi," she said warmly. "I'm sorry for the wait. Can I get you anything?" The man looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Just a cup of coffee, please," he replied. As she headed to the coffee pot, Megan muttered under her breath, loud enough for the young woman to hear. People like him shouldn't expect special treatment. The young woman froze. She turned slowly, her voice rising just enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "Special treatment? He's not asking for anything special, just basic decency. And if you knew who he was, you'd be ashamed of yourself." Megan scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh yeah, and who is he?" The young woman paused, glancing at the elderly man, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Then she took a deep breath, her next words cutting through the diner like a blade. "He's my father." The collective gasp from the customers was almost audible. Megan's face went pale, her bravado crumbling in an instant. But before anyone could say another word, the young woman continued, her tone steady but filled with an unmistakable fire. "And let me tell you something about my father." The room remained silent as the young woman's words hum in the air, each syllable weighted with meaning. Megan shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't respond. The other customers sat frozen, their curiosity piqued. Who was this man, and why was Megan so resistant to serving him? And more importantly, what was the story behind the young woman's sharp defense of him? The young woman placed the steaming cup of coffee in front of her father, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a brief moment. She looked at him with a mix of love and respect, her eyes silently asking if he wanted her to continue. He gave her another small nod, his expression calm, though there was something unspoken in his gaze. "My father," the young woman began, her voice steady but carrying a note of emotion, "is the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back, even if it was the only one he owned. He's the kind of man who spent his whole life working hard and helping others, no matter how he was treated in return." The elderly man sipped his coffee, his hands cradling the cup as though it was more than just a drink. It was a moment of comfort amidst the storm brewing around him. The young woman pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, her focus shifting back to Megan. "You don't know him," she said, her tone softening just enough to make her words feel less like an attack and more like a plea for understanding. "But maybe you should." Megan crossed her arms, still trying to maintain her composure, but the cracks were starting to show. "I don't see what this has to do with me," she muttered, though her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. The young woman tilted her head slightly, studying Megan. "It has everything to do with you. Because the way you treat someone you don't know says a lot about who you are. And right now, it's not saying anything good." A murmur rippled through the diner. A few customers nodded in agreement, while others leaned in closer, eager to hear more. The tension in the air was thick, but so was the curiosity. The young woman glanced around the room, as if deciding whether to continue in front of an audience. She caught her father's eye again, and this time he gave her the faintest of smiles, a silent signal that it was okay to tell the story. "Growing up," she began, her voice carrying a hint of nostalgia, "my father always taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it might be. He used to tell me, character isn't built when things are easy, it's built when they're not. And believe me, life wasn't easy for him." She paused, her eyes glazing over slightly as she got lost in a memory. "He was born in a time when people judged you by the color of your skin before they even knew your name. He worked twice as hard as everyone else, not because he wanted to, but because the asterisk had asterisk too. And even when people treated him unfairly, he never let it make him bitter. He just kept going." Maven shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable but unable to walk away. The other customers were equally captivated, their breakfasts forgotten as they hung on to every word. "My father didn't just work hard for himself," the young woman continued. "He worked hard for his family, for his community. He's the reason I was able to go to college, the reason I have the opportunities I do today. And let me tell you, those opportunities didn't come easy for him to give." She turned back to Megan, her tone sharpening again. "So when you look at him and decide he doesn't deserve the same respect as everyone else here, you're not just insulting him. You're insulting everything he's ever done to make this world a little better." Megan opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her face was a mixture of shame and defiance, as though she was grappling with the weight of the young woman's words, but didn't want to admit she might be in the wrong. The young woman leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, though it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "And if you think he doesn't notice how you've treated him today, you're wrong. He notices. He always notices, but he's too gracious to call you out on it, so I'll do it for him." The elderly man placed a gentle hand on his daughter's arm, his touch calming but firm. "That's enough, sweetheart," he said quietly. His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that carried authority without raising in volume. She hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to say more and respecting her father's wish to keep the situation from escalating further. Finally, she nodded and leaned back in her chair, her expression softening as she looked at him. The silence in the diner was almost oppressive. Megan looked down at her feet, her face now flushed with a mix of embarrassment and guilt. The other customers were still watching, their expressions a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and quiet judgment. But the elderly man didn't seem interested in drawing out the tension any longer. He took another sip of his coffee and set the cup down gently. Then he looked up at Megan, his eyes kind despite everything that had just happened. "I know you're young," he said, his voice calm but with a quiet strength that commanded attention. "And I know the world can be a hard place sometimes. But you've got a choice in how you treat people. Every day, you have that choice. And I hope the next time you're faced with it, you'll choose better. Megan's lip trembled, but she didn't say anything. The weight of his words seemed to sink in, though whether it would lead to any real change remained to be seen. The young woman reached across the table, placing her hand over her father's. "Let's go, Dad," she said softly. "We've got places to be." As they stood to leave, the other customers began murmuring again, their voices filled with a mixture of admiration for the man and disdain for the way he had been treated. One by one, people nodded at the elderly man as he passed, their silent gestures of respect speaking louder than words ever could. The young woman held the door open for her father, and as they stepped out into the crisp morning air, she looked back one last time. Megan was still standing behind the counter, her eyes following them with an expression that was hard to read. But neither the young woman nor her father lingered on it. They had done what they came to do. As they walked away, side by side, the story of what had happened inside the diner was already beginning to ripple outward, leaving an impression on everyone who had witnessed it. And though the tension of the moment was far from resolved, one thing was clear: this was a story that wasn't over yet. As the door swung shut behind them, the young woman and her father stepped out into the cool morning air, the faint chatter from the diner still audible behind them. She glanced at him, her face a mix of frustration and concern. He walked slowly, his cane tapping against the sidewalk, the weight of the moments seeming to hang over them both. "Dad," she began, breaking the silence. "Why didn't you let me say more? She deserved to hear it." The elderly man stopped and turned to her, his gaze steady but kind. "Because sometimes showing grace is more than raising your voice," he replied. "People don't change because you shame them. They change when they see something themselves they want to fix." She sighed, looking down at her hands. "But what if she doesn't? What if she just keeps treating people like that?" He smiled faintly, a smile that carried the weight of years and hard-earned wisdom. "Then that's on her, not us. But we did our part, and that's what matters." As they walked toward her car, the weight of the morning still clung to her, the events playing a loop in her mind. She couldn't shake the memory of the way Megan had looked at her father, the disdain in her eyes. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was something deeper, something uglier. And that thought gnawed at her. Back inside the diner, Megan was still standing behind the counter, staring at the spot where the man and his daughter had been sitting. She felt the eyes of the other customers on her, their silent judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. One of the regulars, an older woman named Ruth, finally broke the silence. "Megan," she said, her tone sharp, "what's gotten into you? That man didn't do a thing to deserve the way you treated him." Megan bristled, her shoulders stiffening. "I don't need a lecture, Ruth," she muttered, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Ruth leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "You do if you're acting like this. That man is someone's father, someone's grandfather maybe. What if it was your dad sitting there? Would you want someone treating him like that?" Megan didn't respond. She focused on the counter, scrubbing at a spot that didn't exist. Across the room, another customer, a man in his 40s named Jack, chimed in. "You don't know who people are, Megan," he said. "For all you know, that man could have been a veteran, or someone who's done more for this community than any of us combined." Megan's hand froze mid-wipe. The truth was, she didn't know anything about him. But the uncomfortable feeling in her chest, the one she didn't want to name, told her that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Meanwhile, in the car, the young woman gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the streets. "I can't believe she acted like that," she said, more to herself than to her father. "It's 2025 and people still do things like this." Her father rested his hand on hers, gently easing her grip on the wheel. "It's not new, sweetheart," he said, "and it won't be the last time. But what matters is how we respond. We can't let their hate turn into our anger." She glanced at him, her frustration softening at his words. "How are you always so calm about this? I don't understand." He smiled faintly. "Because I've had years to learn what's worth my energy. And that woman back there, she's not worth losing sleep over. But even as he said the words, a shadow crossed his face, so fleeting that his daughter almost missed it. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but before she could, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it briefly and sighed. "Work's calling," she said, pulling over to answer. "Give me a second, okay?" He nodded, watching as she stepped out of the car to take the call. Alone in the silence, his thoughts drifted back to the diner. He wasn't angry, not exactly. But there was a heaviness in his chest, a familiar ache he hadn't felt in years. Back at the diner, Megan was finishing her shift in silence. The usual hum of friendly chatter had faded, replaced by an awkward tension. When her manager, a burly man named Hank, called her into the back office, she felt her stomach drop. "Megan," he said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the desk, "we need to talk about what happened this morning." She looked down, avoiding his gaze. "I know," she muttered. "I messed up." Hank sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Messed up is putting it lightly. You can't treat customers like that, especially not someone like him." She frowned, finally meeting his eyes. "What do you mean, someone like him?" Hank hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Finally, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "That man isn't just any customer. He's Mr. Lewis." The name didn't register immediately, and Megan's confusion must have shown on her face because Hank sighed again. "Edgar Lewis," he said. "He's one of the most respected men in this community. Helped rebuild the library after it burned down, funded scholarships for underprivileged kids, and organized food drives for years. And you," he stopped, shaking his head in disbelief. "You treated him like he didn't belong here." Megan's face turned pale, her stomach churning with a mix of guilt and panic. She had no idea who the man was, but now it was painfully clear that she'd made a mistake. As the truth of Hank's words sank in, Megan felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She wanted to apologize to make it right somehow, but the man and his daughter were already gone. And she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe an apology wouldn't be enough. Outside the diner, the young woman ended her call and climbed back into the car, her father watching her with quiet curiosity. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her expression was still tense. "Yeah, just work stuff." He smiled knowingly. "You've always been a terrible liar." She laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension in the car. "Fine," she admitted. I hate that people still act like that. It makes me feel like we haven't made any progress." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "We have, sweetheart. But progress isn't a straight line. It's a path we walk every day. And some days we take a step back before we can move forward again." As they drove away, both of them couldn't help but wonder how the events of the morning would ripple outward. For the young woman, it was a reminder of the battles still left to fight. For her father, it was another chapter in a lifetime of lessons learned. And for Megan, it was the beginning of a reckoning she hadn't seen coming. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, the pieces were still falling into place, the tension building towards something none of them could yet see. The next day, the small town seemed quieter than usual, as if the tension from the diner had seeped into the streets. Word had spread quickly. Stories always did in a place like this. By the time Megan clocked in for her shift, the air in the diner felt heavier, the usual chatter subdued. She avoided eye contact with the regulars, feeling their glances like tiny pinpricks of judgment. Her mind replayed Hank's words over and over, * Edgar Lewis, one of the most respected men in this community. * she couldn't believe she had treated someone like that. But it wasn't just about his reputation. It was the way his daughter had looked at her, with a mix of disbelief and disappointment that stuck with her long after they'd left. By mid-morning, Megan was moving through her tasks on autopilot when the diner bell jingled. She turned instinctively, and her heart sank. It was him. Edgar Lewis walked in, his cane tapping lightly against the floor as he moved with quiet dignity. His daughter wasn't with him this time. The diner went still. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks paused in mid-air, and all eyes turned to Megan. Her chest tightened as he made his way to the same table by the window, the one he'd sat at the day before. He placed his hat on the table, folded his hands, and looked out the window, as if unaware of the scene unfolding around him. Megan froze. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her tray suddenly too heavy to hold. Ruth, who was sitting at the counter, gave her a pointed look. "Well?" she whispered. "Aren't you going to serve him?" The words felt like a challenge, but also a lifeline. Megan took a deep breath and forced her legs to move. With trembling hands, she grabbed a menu and walked over to his table, her heart pounding with every step. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I get you something to drink?" Edgar looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and Megan felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Then finally he spoke. "Coffee," he said simply. "Black." She nodded quickly, her hands shaking as she wrote it down, even though there was no need to. As she turned to walk away, he added, "Thank you." The two words caught her off guard. She glanced back at him, but his gaze had returned to the window, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined the kindness in his tone. Back in the kitchen, Megan gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. The other waitstaff whispered among themselves, casting her sideways glances. She could feel their curiosity, their judgment, and it made her stomach churn. When she brought the coffee to his table, he looked up at her again, his expression as calm as before. She set the cup down carefully, avoiding his eyes. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked, her voice still trembling. He shook his head. "This is fine, thank you." She nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You seem nervous," he said, his tone soft but direct. Megan froze, her back to him. She took a deep breath and turned around slowly. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For yesterday, it was wrong of me." Edgar studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slightly. "Thank you for saying that." The simple acknowledgement was almost more than Megan could handle. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly and excused herself, retreating to the kitchen. Meanwhile, outside the diner, Edgar's daughter sat in her car, watching through the window. She had decided to let her father come alone, knowing he wanted the space to handle things his way. But that didn't mean she wasn't keeping an eye on him. As she watched Megan retreat to the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to march back inside and finish what she had started the day before, to make sure Megan truly understood the weight of her actions. But another part of her trusted her father's judgment, knowing he had a way of teaching lessons without ever raising his voice. Inside, Edgar sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the quiet moment. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, but he paid them no mind. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to show that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. The tension in the diner was palpable, each moment stretching longer than the last. Megan stayed in the kitchen, busying herself with small tasks to avoid the weight of the stairs outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about yesterday. It was about something bigger, something she was only beginning to understand. Finally, Edgar finished his coffee and stood, placing a few bills on the table. As he put on his hat and made his way to the door, the room seemed to hold its breath. He paused just before leaving, turning back to the counter where Megan had reappeared, watching him from a distance. "Have a good day," he said, his voice calm and steady. The words lingered in the air long after he was gone, leaving Megan and everyone else in the diner to wrestle with what they had witnessed. The tension had reached its peak, but the resolution was still just out of reach, hanging like a question waiting to be answered. As Edgar stepped out of the diner and onto the sidewalk, the late morning sun glinted off his cane. He moved with deliberate steps, his face calm and unreadable. Across the street, his daughter watched from her car, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel. She noticed the slight pause in his stride as he neared her car, and for a moment her concern deepened. But when he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, his expression betrayed nothing. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. Edgar adjusted his hat, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It went the way it needed to," he replied, his tone giving nothing away. His daughter bit her lip, wanting to press for more details but knowing better than to push. Instead, she started the car and pulled away from the curb, the diner shrinking in the rearview mirror. She couldn't help but glance back, wondering what was left unresolved in that small building. Inside, Megan leaned against the counter, her mind racing. She thought she'd feel relief when Edgar left, but instead, a new weight settled over her, heavier than the one before. Something about the way he had looked at her, so calm and composed, made her feel more ashamed than any angry outburst ever could. As she replayed the morning in her mind, the doorbell jingled again, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned, expecting another customer, but her heart sank when she saw who it was. A woman in her early 30s, sharply dressed and exuding a quiet authority, stepped inside. It was Edgar's daughter. The room went silent once more, every pair of eyes shifting between Megan and the woman. Unlike her father, the daughter didn't carry an air of quiet grace. Her presence was commanding, her gaze piercing as she scanned the room. When her eyes landed on Megan, she walked straight to the counter, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed her hands on the counter and leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "Do you know who my father is?" Megan's stomach churned. "I know now," she stammered. The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Good. Then you know he's spent his entire life giving to this community. He's helped people who didn't deserve it, who would have turned their backs on him in a second. But he still gave, because that's the kind of man he is." Megan looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "My father doesn't hold grudges," the woman continued. "But me, I'm not so forgiving. What you did yesterday wasn't just disrespectful, it was cruel. And it wasn't just about him. It was about what he represents, what people like him have had to endure for generations." Megan's chest tightened, the weight of the words hitting her like a punch. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The woman leaned back, her expression softening slightly. "I'm not here to punish you," she said. "But you need to understand something. Respect isn't about knowing someone's name or what they've done. It's about treating every person who walks through that door like they matter, because they do." Megan nodded slowly, her cheeks burning with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Now show it." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Megan standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. The other customers quickly returned to their conversations, the tension in the room easing slightly. But for Megan, the moment wasn't over. It lingered, pressing down on her like a storm cloud that refused to pass. As the day wore on, Megan found herself replaying the encounter with Edgar's daughter over and over. Her words echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She thought about Edgar, about the quiet dignity he had shown despite everything. And for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. Later that evening, long after her shift ended, Megan found herself sitting at the diner's counter, staring at the empty coffee cup Edgar had used earlier that day. She didn't know why she hadn't cleared it away. Maybe it was a reminder. She reached for her phone, hesitating for a moment before pulling up the search bar. Typing in Edgar Lewis, she hit enter and was immediately greeted with a flood of articles, photos, and videos. As she scrolled through the pages, she felt her chest tighten. There were stories about the library he had rebuilt, the scholarships he had funded, the food drives he had organized. But there was more. Stories of protests he had led in the 1960s, of marches he had joined, of moments where he had stood up against injustice, when it would have been easier to stay silent. Megan sat there for hours, reading and watching, the weight of her actions growing heavier with each passing minute. By the time she finally put her phone down, the diner was dark and empty, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done. But for the first time, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't expected, the need to make things right. The next morning, Megan arrived at the diner before sunrise. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts consumed by everything she'd learned about Edgar Lewis. Each story she read, each photo she saw, painted a clearer picture of the man she had dismissed so easily. She knew she couldn't erase her mistake, but she was determined to face it head-on. As the first rays of sunlight spilled through the windows, she began setting up the diner with more care than usual. She wiped down every table, straightened every chair, and even placed a small vase with a fresh flower on the corner of each booth. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. By mid-morning, the diner was bustling as usual, and Megan moved through her tasks with a new sense of purpose. Every customer she greeted, every plate she delivered, she did with a smile and genuine warmth. She couldn't help but glance at the door every few minutes, wondering if Edgar would come back. Then, just as the clock struck noon, the bell above the door jingled. Megan looked up, her heart skipping a beat. There he was, standing tall and steady, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. But this time he wasn't alone. His daughter was with him, her expression unreadable as they made their way to the same booth by the window. The diner fell quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Megan wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath before approaching their table. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move, each step heavier than the last. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "It's nice to see you again. Can I get you anything to start?" Edgar looked up at her, his expression calm but thoughtful. He didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her squirm. Then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "Coffee," he said. "Black. And for my daughter, tea. Earl Grey." Megan nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "Coming right up." She hurried back to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she prepared their drinks. When she returned to the table, she set the cups down carefully, avoiding their gaze. "Thank you," Edgar said, his voice warm but firm. Megan took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "I just want to say again how sorry I am for how I treated you. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize now how wrong I was. I know I can't change what happened, but I'm trying to be better. I want to be better." For a long moment, Edgar didn't respond. He simply studied her, his gaze steady and unwavering. His daughter, too, seemed to be weighing her words, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Megan's demeanor. Finally, Edgar spoke. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said, "but it takes even more courage to change." Megan felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As the tension began to ease, the diner door swung open again, and a group of young kids ran in, laughing and chattering. One of them, a boy no older than 10, paused when he saw Edgar. His face lit up, and he ran over to the table, clutching a small notebook. "Mr. Lewis," the boy exclaimed, "can I have your autograph? My mom told me about what you did at the library." Edgar chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Of course," he said, taking the notebook and pen. Megan watched the exchange, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. It was a moment of pure connection, a reminder of the impact one person could have on so many lives. But just as the boy turned to leave, Edgar's daughter spoke up, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Megan, I think there's something you should know." Megan froze, her pulse quickening. She turned to face her, the warmth in her chest replaced by a cold knot of dread. "My father," the woman began, her tone measured, "isn't just respected in this community because of his past. He's also my biggest inspiration." She paused, her gaze piercing. "And he's the reason I'm running for mayor." The revelation hit Megan like a freight train. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of her vision blurring. She looked between Edgar and his daughter, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Edgar's daughter smiled faintly, her expression both challenging and compassionate. "This isn't just about one mistake," she said. "It's about understanding the bigger picture, about realizing that every action, no matter how small, has consequences." Megan nodded slowly, her voice catching in her throat. "I understand," she said softly. As Edgar and his daughter finished their drinks and prepared to leave, Megan felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of responsibility. She watched them walk out the door, their silhouettes framed by the afternoon sun, and knew that this was only the beginning of her journey. But as the bell jingled and the door swung shut, Edgar turned back one last time, his eyes meeting Megan's. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that spoke louder than words. And in that moment, Megan felt something she hadn't expected: hope.